it seems pretty inconceivable that the Russian military have the wherewithal to advance on and take Kyiv. So as you say, it can absolutely be threatened and pummeled by missiles. But the idea that the Russian forces have the ability, indeed the will, to advance towards Kyiv, I think is most unlikely. It'd be a very, very challenging city take. And we saw how determinedly the populace of Kyiv fought last time, and you can guarantee they'd do the same again. I think the first thing to recognise, John, is, through the winter, there was, lots of people said nothing would happen through the winter because it doesn't the snow or cold will slow things down. Actually, the Ukrainians had hoped to maintain their momentum through the winter. In practice, that didn't come about, arguably in part because of the delay in the provision of Western equipment. So here we are going into spring, which is historically when you get a sort of upturn in offensive activity. So what's to come? As you say, I think we're going to see a lot of speculation over the coming weeks, and I think we should all be really clear that whatever comes will not be what we're expecting. This is a game of chess, and both sides will be playing bluff and counter bluff. So it may well be the Russians are seeking to probe, try and find positions of weakness that they can exploit with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will make public proclamations about where they think the attack might come, and that may very well be where they think it might come, or it may be them very reasonably playing bluff and trying to keep the Russians guessing. So the Ukrainians will be looking, with the support of other intelligence agencies, for where those critical buildups of Russian forces are. So you mentioned Bakhmut in the center. That would seem a credible place for the Russians to go. Taking Bakhmut would be significant for Putin. He's sweated over it for months and months and months, spilt considerable blood there. Is it of great significance? Not really, but it is in terms of status. So certainly, I think there'll be talk of Bakhmut. You mentioned Kharkiv. Again, there's Ukraine's second city. It's only 25 miles from the Russian border.
Yes,
and so that feels a significant objective. And then potentially he could attack further south. There's talk of attacking towards Zaporizhia. These are the sorts of names I think we're going to see being talked about over the coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, Kyiv, just to pick on that one momentarily, just 25 miles from the Russian border, and has not been taken by Russia, which seems so odd, so close to the border there, so well within reach of the massed forces, which are still at the disposal of the Russian military. How's it held out?
Well, I mean, great bravery, I think is the first thing to say. Absolute determination by the Ukrainians. And although it's not been taken, I mean, it remains under intense pressure from the Russians, near constant missile strikes against it. But has not fallen. And, what we've seen since those early days of the Russian invasion back in late February last year, when the Russians tried to make their big moves and they failed, they just have not had if like the military artistry to really break through Ukrainian lines, and it's allowed very, very determined Ukrainian defense and innovation to hold their cities and villages.
Now, can we assume at this point now, Rupert, that Kyiv is unattainable, that it is beyond Russia's reach? I don't mean the reach of missiles and drones and so on, because that clearly isn't the case, but it cannot now be expected to fall to Russian forces.
I think it's, never say never, but it seems pretty inconceivable that the Russian military have the wherewithal to advance on and take Kyiv. So as you say, it can absolutely be threatened and pummeled by missiles, but the idea that the Russian forces have the ability, indeed the will, to advance towards Kyiv, I think is most unlikely. It'd be a very, very challenging city take. And we saw how determinedly the populace of Kyiv fought last time, and you can guarantee they'd do the same again.
I was reading some interesting analysis from a leading strategist over the weekend about the likely shape and form of the Russian advance, and it had a lot to do with using troops, in many cases they're least well-trained, conscripts, throwing them into the front line and using them almost literally as cannon fodder, just soaking up the Ukrainian barrage and better troops just trying to push forward behind them, which is an extraordinarily callous and wasteful in terms of human life form of warfare, but very much in the Russian playbook, is it not?
It is, and of course they have a strong history of this, going back to the Second World War and further back. So as you say, their assaults into Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have talked about almost human waves. Cannon fodder is the term they've been using, and that in many cases has been, we understand, Wagner Group individuals who were released from Russian prisons. They were given some degree of clemency if they went to the fight, and they have been literally thrown into what looks like a deeply unpleasant meat grinder. Now that will not get the Russians anywhere in terms of a proper offensive.
Yeah.
There is talk that some of the mobilized forces that, from where it was 6 months ago, have now been trained, have been used to reinforce slightly more capable mechanized units, and ultimately it's going to need to be proper mechanized units if they're going to have a credible offensive and not just throw more people to their death. Then they're going to need grown-up mechanized forces.
Yeah, and it's encouraging, isn't it, from the Ukraine perspective, that if not now, then soon, as allies start to push in the kind of heavy weaponry and advanced weaponry that Ukraine needs, that Ukraine will have the weapons that it needs to strike anywhere in Russian-held territory, which will inhibit Russia's ability to gain ground.
Oh, undoubtedly. And the Russians will not have it their own way. If they're going to get these forces ready, they have to bring them forward to assembly areas. They'll hold them back as deep as they can, but at some point they have to come forward, and they will be very vulnerable at that point. The Ukrainians have demonstrated themselves to be very capable at locating Russian forces and striking them in advance.
Yeah.
And again, the Russians have not really demonstrated the kind of the skills, the techniques to mask their forces. So as you say, with increasing array of Western weapons at the Ukrainians' disposal, and fought in Ukrainian style, with an innovation and a panache that, frankly, we should all learn from.